You know, I never thought I'd be the one sitting here telling this story. My name's Frank Coleman, and for 30 years I barely spoke to my own son. 30 years of birthdays missed, holidays spent apart, and memories never made. All because I couldn't understand his world and he couldn't understand mine. I'm a Vietnam veteran who came home to a country I barely recognized and raised a son who grew up in a world so different from the one I knew. That generation gap between us, it was more like a canyon's. But today, I want to share how we finally built that bridge across it. Not because our story is special, but because if we could find our way back to each other after all that time. Maybe you can too. I enlisted in 1967. 19 years old, head full of patriotism and duty. My father had fought in World War II, his father in the First. It's what men in my family did. We served. When I came home in '71, everything had changed. The country, the culture, the music, the politics, and me. I'd seen things no young man should see. Done things I couldn't talk about. Carried memories I couldn't shake. I met Sarah that same year. We married fast, had our son Michael in '73. I tried to be a good father, I really did. But I only knew one way to raise a boy, the way my father raised me. Discipline, structure, respect for authority. Yes sir, no sir, a firm hand. Michael was different from the start. Sensitive, asked too many questions. Always had his nose in a book or was drawing these elaborate pictures. I didn't understand him. By the time he hit his teens in the late '80s, the gap between us was growing wider every day. He liked that loud music with people screaming. Wore his hair long. Questioned everything, the government, the military, authority in general. Everything I stood for, he seemed to stand against. The arguments started small. Curfew. Grades. Friends I didn't approve of. But they grew bigger. The night he told me he wanted to go to art school instead of college. That was our first real blowout. I said some things. Terrible things. Called his dreams worthless. Said no son of mine would waste his life drawing pictures. He left for college and barely came home. When he did, we'd inevitably fight. After his graduation, he moved across the country to California. Started a design career. Met Jason, the man who would become his partner. When he called to tell me about Jason, well, that was it. I couldn't accept it. Wouldn't accept it. It was 1995. A different time, but that's no excuse. I told him not to come home until he'd figured himself out. He took me at my word. For nearly 30 years. You know what's funny about a family rift? At first, it feels like standing your ground. Like you're right and they're wrong, and eventually they'll see it your way. But as years pass, it starts feeling more like standing on an ice floe that's drifting further and further from shore. Sarah stayed in touch with Michael. They'd talk on the phone and later by email. She'd visit him in California once a year. She'd come back with stories and photos that she'd show me, even though I pretended not to care. Michael building his design business. Michael and Jason buying their first home. Their dogs. Their friends. Their life. I'd grunt and change the subject, but I'd sneak looks at those photos later. Watch my son growing older in snapshots without me there. The hardest part wasn't the big moments I missed, though there were plenty. It was the everyday stuff. Never knowing what made him laugh now. What kept him up at nights. What he worried about. What he hoped for. I filled my days with work at the hardware store I managed. Spent weekends fishing or working in my garage workshop. Built. Furniture nobody needed. Joined the VFW. Surrounded myself with other vets who understood me, who shared my experiences and worldview. But at night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I'd wonder about him. Wonder if he ever thought about me. In 2008, Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer. Stage 4. Michael came home for the first time in years. We were civil to each other, distant but polite, like awkward strangers connected by the woman we both loved. Sarah made us promise her dying wish that we'd try to reconnect after she was gone. We both nodded, held her hands, and promised. But when she passed 6 months later, the gap between us seemed even wider without her there to bridge it. He flew back to California the day after the funeral. I went back to my empty house and my routines. And for years, that's how we stayed. Separate worlds, separate lives. Christmas cards. Occasional stilted phone calls that never lasted more than 5 minutes. The generation gap had become a way of life. It's strange how change can come from unexpected places. For me, it started with my knees, of all things. Years of standing on concrete floors at the hardware store had taken their toll. By 2018, I needed double knee replacement surgery. The doctor asked about my support system for recovery. Who would help me at home? Drive me to physical therapy. I realized with a kind of hollow feeling that I didn't really have anyone. Most of my friends were dealing with their own health issues. Neighbors had moved away or passed on. For the first time, I felt truly alone. I mentioned it offhandedly during one of those brief birthday calls with Michael. Just said I was having some surgery, nothing to worry about. I didn't ask for help, wouldn't have dreamed of it. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. I hobbled over with my cane, opened it, and there stood Michael. Suitcase in hand. Older, grayer than in the photos, but with the same eyes. His mother's eyes. Dad, he said, I hear you need some help. I almost closed the door. Almost sent him away out of pure stubborn pride. But something stopped me. Maybe it was seeing those eyes again. Maybe it was just being tired of being alone. How long can you stay? I asked. As long as you need, he said. I can work remotely, and just like that, my son moved back into his childhood bedroom. At 45 years old, to take care of his 70-year-old father who had barely spoken to him for decades. The first few days were awkward beyond belief. We moved around each other carefully, like dancers who didn't know the steps. He'd help me to the bathroom, adjust my pillows, bring me meals. All in near silence. But then came the surgery, and with it, pain and medication and vulnerability I couldn't hide. He saw me at my weakest, confused from anesthesia, unable to get out of bed without help, frustrated to tears during those first painful physical therapy sessions. It's hard for a man of my generation to be seen that way. We were taught to be strong, to never show weakness. But there I was, completely dependent on the son I'd pushed away for so long. What? And you know what? He never once made me feel ashamed of it. Not once. Recovery is slow when you're 70. Weeks stretched into months and Michael stayed. We developed routines. Morning coffee. Evening news. Physical therapy exercises in the living room. Slowly, cautiously, we began to talk. Not about the past at first, that was still too raw. But about safe topics. The weather. The sports. The neighborhood changes. One evening about 2 months in, I noticed him sketching while we watched TV. Just like he used to as a kid. Without thinking, I asked to see what he was drawing. He hesitated, then handed me his tablet. It was a design for a website, something for a veterans organization. I didn't understand all the technical aspects, but I could see it was good work. Clean. Professional. You did this, I asked. It's what I do, Dad, he said quietly. I've been a professional designer for over 20 years. That hit me hard. 20 years of his career that I knew nothing about. 20 years of skill and talent developed that I'd once dismissed as worthless. Show me more, I said. That night, he walked me through his portfolio on his laptop. Designs for major companies. Award-winning campaigns. Work that had been seen by millions of people. I realized something that night that seems so obvious now. My son was successful. Not in the way I'd imagined success, but undeniably, impressively successful in his own field. A field I knew nothing about. I never understood what you do, I admitted. I know, Dad, he said. You never asked. That simple exchange opened something between us. The next day, I asked him to teach me how to use the internet properly. I'd been resistant to technology, had an old flip phone and barely used email. But suddenly, I wanted to understand his world. He was patient, starting with the basics. How to search for information. How to video chat. How to find and watch videos on topics that interested me. In return, I showed him things from my world. How to properly sharpen a chisel. How to identify different wood grains. We spent an afternoon in my workshop, and I showed him a rocking chair I'd built years ago. That's beautiful craftsmanship, Dad, he said, running his hand over the arm. Your mother always liked it, I told him. I remember, he said. She sent me pictures. We both went quiet then, thinking of Sarah. How she would have loved to see us working side by side in that garage. That night, we had our first real conversation about Jason. Not just acknowledging his existence, but really talking about him. About their life together. Their homes. Their friends. Their struggles and joys. I listened, really listened, maybe for the first time. I'd like to meet him someday, I said finally. If that's okay, Michael looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He'd like that too, Dad. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. No dramatic hugs or tearful apologies. Just a small bridge being built, one plank at a time, across that generation gap. As my recovery progressed, Michael and I found that doing things together was easier than just talking. Shared activities gave us purpose, something to focus on besides the years of distance between us. We started small. Cooking together became an unexpected bonding activity. Neither of us was particularly skilled in the kitchen. Sarah had always handled that. But now we'd look up recipes online and fumble through them together. We made some truly terrible meals at first, laughed about them, and gradually got better. I taught him my mother's meatloaf recipe from memory. He introduced me to foods I'd never tried, quinoa, kale, things I'd dismissed as California food. Some of it wasn't half bad. Cooking led to grocery shopping together, which led to exploring the changed neighborhood together. The old movie theater was now a craft brewery. The vacant lot where kids used to play ball was now a community garden. This town's not what it used to be, I grumbled one day. Is that good or bad? Michael asked. I had to think about that. Different, I finally said. Not all bad, he nodded. Same with people, maybe. I knew what he was getting at. We were both different than we'd been 30 years ago. Not all bad. One rainy afternoon, we dug out old family photo albums. Pictures of Michael as a baby. His little leg games. Family vacations. Sarah, young and beautiful. Tell me about when you met Mom, he said. So I did. Told him stories he'd never heard. How I was nervous on our first date. How she wore a blue dress. how she liked daisies better than roses. He told me stories too. How she'd visit him in California and always wanted to see the ocean. How she'd send him care packages with my favorite cookies in them, even though I didn't know it. She never gave up on us finding our way back to each other, he said. She was always smarter than both of us, I replied. As my mobility improved, we ventured further. Took a day trip to the fishing spot I'd frequented for years. I showed him how to cast properly, something I should have taught him as a boy. "Did Grandpa teach you to fish?" he asked as we sat waiting for a bite. "Everything I know about it," I said. He was a patient man. "More patient than I was with you. You did your best, Dad," he said after a while. "No," I said. "I didn't. But I'd like to do better now." That fishing trip led to other outings. A baseball game. A car show. A visit to the VFW where I introduced him to my veteran friends. To my surprise, he connected easily with them. Asked thoughtful questions about their service. Listened to their stories with genuine interest. One of the younger vets had served in Afghanistan, and he and Michael talked for an hour about the differences between Vietnam and modern warfare. "Your son's all right, Frank," my old friend Bill said after Michael stepped away. "Got a good head on his shoulders." "Yeah," I said, watching Michael across the room. "He does." One day, Michael suggested we visit the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. I'd never been, had actively avoided it for decades. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," I told him. "I'll be right there with you," he said. "If you want to try." We made the trip a month later. Standing before that black granite, seeing the names of men I'd known, feeling Michael's hand on my shoulder, it was one of the hardest and most healing experiences of my life. As we stood there, I found myself telling him stories I'd never told anyone except other vets. About the fear, the confusion, the loss, the things I'd carried silently for 50 years. He just listened. No judgment. No politics. Just a son finally understanding his father's formative experience. "This is why you are the way you are," he said quietly. Part of it I acknowledged. Not an excuse. But yes, part of it we both understood. Something fundamental that day. The generation gap between us wasn't just about different music or politics or values. It was about vastly different worlds that had shaped us. 6 months into Michael's stay, we'd established a comfortable routine. My recovery was progressing well. I was more mobile, needed less help. The original reason for his visit was fading. One evening after dinner, he brought up what we'd both been avoiding. "Dad, I need to head back to California soon. Jason misses me. Work needs me in person for some projects." I nodded, feeling a familiar wall starting to go up. "Of course. You've got your own life," but he continued. I was thinking, "Why don't you come with me? For a visit. Meet Jason. See where I live. Maybe stay a few weeks." The old me would have dismissed this immediately. Too far. Too different. Too much. Instead, I found myself considering it. "I don't know, Michaels. California's not really my speed. Just think about it," he said. "And there's something else we should talk about while I'm still here." "What's that?" I asked, though I had a feeling I knew. "The past," he said simply. "All those years. All those things we never said." And so began the hardest conversations of our reconciliation. Over several evenings, we talked through the painful history between us. The hurtful words. The missed opportunities. The misunderstandings. "When you told me not to come home until I'd figured myself out," Michael said during one of these talks, "I had figured myself out. That was the problem. I knew exactly who I was and you couldn't accept it. I was wrong, I said, the words still difficult to form even now. I was scared of what I didn't understand. Scared of a world that was changing too fast. It was easier to push you away than to change myself. I could have tried harder to understand your world too, he admitted. I dismissed everything about your generation as outdated and wrong. I never really tried to see things from your perspective. We talked about Sarah, about how she tried to keep us connected even when we resisted. She never took sides, Michael said. Even when I wanted her to, she was wiser than both of us, I agreed. These conversations weren't easy. There were raised voices sometimes. Tears other times. Old wounds reopened before they could properly heal. But with each difficult discussion, the weight of 30 years of silence lightened a little. One night after a particularly emotional conversation, I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. Why did you come when I needed help? After everything, Michael was quiet for a long moment. Because you're my father, he said finally. And because Mom would have wanted me to. And because I missed you. Even when I was angriest, I missed you. That night, I decided to go to California. I flew to San Francisco 2 weeks later. First time on a plane in decades. First time in California ever. Michael and Jason met me at the airport. I'd been nervous about meeting Jason, but he made it easy. Warm handshake, genuine smile. He thanked me for sharing Michael with him these past months. Told me he'd heard a lot about me. Good things, I hope, I said. Honest things, he replied with a smile. I liked him immediately. Their home was nothing like I'd imagined. Not some radical California stereotype, just a comfortable house with a nice garden. Pictures on the walls. Books on the shelves. A home. They had a guest room ready for me. On the bedside table was a framed photo of Sarah that I'd never seen before. Her at the Golden Gate Bridge, smiling in the sunshine. She took that on her first visit to see us, Michael explained. She loved it here those 2 weeks. In California changed everything. Jason turned out to be an excellent cook and a patient tour guide. He showed me around their neighborhood, introduced me to their friends. Their friends, gay and straight, all ages, all backgrounds, welcomed me warmly. No one seemed bothered by my occasional old-fashioned comments or confused questions. They just gently educated me when I got something wrong. I met Michael's colleagues, saw his design studio, finally understood the work he did and the respect he'd earned in his field. Watched him in his element, confident and capable in ways I'd never witnessed. One evening, their neighbor Carl, another Vietnam vet, came over for dinner. We swapped war stories while Michael and Jason listened. Later, Carl told me how proud he was of the younger generation and how they'd fought their own battles for recognition and rights. Different war, same courage, he said, nodding toward Michael and Jason. I'd never thought of it that way before. By the end of those 2 weeks, something fundamental had shifted. The generation gap hadn't disappeared. We still had different perspectives, different references, different ways of seeing the world. But it no longer felt like an unbridgeable chasm. As I prepared to fly home, Michael and Jason made me a proposal. We've been thinking, Michael said. That guest room is always open for you. Anytime for as long as you want. And we'd like to spend holidays together from now on, alternating between here and your place. We could come for Christmas this year, Jason added. If that works for you. I looked at these two men, my son and the person he loved, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Family. I'd like that, I said. Very much. It's been 5 years now since Michael showed up at my door with his suitcase. 5 years of building and strengthening the bridge across our generation gap. I'm 75 now, and I've learned a few things about family reconciliation that might help others facing similar divides. First, it takes humility. Real, ego-crushing humility to admit when you've been wrong. To acknowledge that your way isn't the only way. That was the hardest part for me, admitting that my rigid views had cost me years with my son. Second, curiosity is crucial. Being genuinely interested in understanding another generation's perspective opens doors. When I finally started asking Michael questions about his world, his work, his life, and really listening to his answers, everything changed. Third, shared activities build bridges better than words alone. Fishing, cooking, watching a game together. These simple shared experiences created connections when conversations stalled. Fourth, patience matters. Reconciliation doesn't happen overnight. There were setbacks. Moments when old patterns emerged. Times when we both retreated to our corners. But we kept trying, kept coming back to the table. Fifth, it helps to remember that every generation is shaped by different defining events. Vietnam shaped me. AIDS and the fight for gay rights shaped Michael. Neither of us could fully understand the other's formative experiences, but we could respect them. Sixth, forgiveness goes both ways. I needed to forgive Michael for what I perceived as rejecting my values. He needed to forgive me for rejecting him. Forgiveness isn't a one-time event, it's an ongoing process. And finally, it's never too late to start. We lost 30 years. 30 years of birthdays, holidays, everyday moments. We can't get those back. But we've had 5 good years now, and hopefully many more ahead. The generation gap doesn't have to be a permanent divide. With effort and understanding from both sides, it can become a place of learning, of growth, of connecting past to future. These days, Michael and Jason visit every few months. We talk weekly by video chat, something I never imagined I'd be comfortable with. Last year, they helped me sell my too-big house and move into a smaller place closer to the downtown area I once avoided. I've made new friends here, younger folks who don't share my history but seem to value my perspective anyway. I've even started mentoring some young veterans at the local VA, helping them bridge their own gaps with family members who can't understand their experiences. Michael and I still disagree on things. Politics, music, how long to grill a steak. But now we can laugh about those differences. They're just part of who we are, not reasons to push each other away. If you're watching this and feeling that ache of family separation, whether it's across generations, politics, lifestyle choices, or any other divide, I hope our story gives you some hope. Some courage to reach out. To try one more time. Family reconciliation isn't easy. It requires both sides to step toward each other to build that bridge from both ends. But even if you've been estranged for years, even decades like we were, that connection can be rebuilt. One conversation, one shared meal, one fishing trip at a time. The generation gap doesn't have to be permanent. With enough love, enough patience, enough willingness to understand each other's worlds, it can be bridged. I just wish we hadn't waited so long to start building. If you have your own story of family reconciliation, or if you're still working on bridging that gap, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. This old veteran has learned that sharing our stories helps others find their way home too. Thank you for listening to mine.